Hmm. Okay, hello everybody, and I'm sure more will be coming. It is now October 23rd, 2025. We're really excited to have Ambassador David Kramer here. He's calling from a different time zone in Texas, and he and I are both smiling. When you look at today's news, there isn't much to smile about. Um, it seems that the cruelty of Vladimir let's just not name him the ruler of the Russian Federation. The cruelty has no limits. In spite, and I'm sure you all have been following this, because the upcoming summit, is not taking place anytime soon. Um, Mr. Putin's response was to incur even more vicious attacks on Ukraine. So, tremendous thanks to those of you who have the stamina and the ability to join us. Um, it's I don't know what to say. We're very disturbed by that. We also have our domestic things. The People's House, the White House, belonging to the people of the United States, part of it is being destroyed as we speak, and this is not a existential problem, but it's something that worries Americans. Now, David, you are I have muted everybody. You can unmute yourself, and let's turn to you now. I see there we go. Okay.
Yep,
Everybody, this is Ambassador David Kramer. He is America's, can I say, leading advocate for human rights. He's done this. He's done this from advocacy groups, from nonprofits, from the um, the now beleaguered bureau in the State Department, DRL, the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. We don't know what sort of future DRL will have. We're all kind of in shock that a U.S. administration would minimize the question of human rights. But David, maybe you could begin by reminding us. I have sent your bio to everybody on this call, but can you recapitulate a bit? You came from an academic background. You were immersed in Russian studies at one point. You've been Human Rights Watch. You've been so many things. Can you just summarize for us your path towards the present job at the
sure.
library?
Sure. Well, Dan, thanks for having me, and it's a real pleasure to join all of you, and particularly those of you I think who are in Ukraine. I think you have some students from there, given what you're going through every day. I wear this. It's a small token of support and solidarity. You've got one there too, but we're rooting for you every single day. So I grew up in Massachusetts. I won't give you the long version of this, but grew up in Massachusetts, and I'm old enough where my degrees are in Soviet studies. The Soviet Union was still around, although it wasn't too long after that Soviet Union collapsed, which was one of the greatest things that happened. And I then moved to Washington, where I worked and lived for 24 years. And in the government, as Dan mentioned, I was the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, but also the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. This was all during the George W. Bush administration. And then I left, and after a job at the German Marshall Fund, I was the president of Freedom House, which is the oldest human rights organization in the US, started by Eleanor Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie, who ran against her husband and lost in the presidential election, and it was launched in 1941 to confront the challenges of isolationism, communism, and fascism. And isolationism still remains a problem that we have to deal with. I then went to the McCain Institute for International Leadership, which is in DC, although part of Arizona State University. And then, for some personal family reasons, moved to Miami, where I taught at Florida International University, which is one of the largest universities in the US in terms of number of students. And then was approached about joining the George W. Bush Institute, And I have been here now almost 4 years, and I serve as the executive director of the Institute, which is the policy arm of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. We're one of 14 presidential centers in the U.S. There are only a few, obviously, that have the former president still alive: President Bush, President Clinton, President Obama, and President Biden now, although he does not yet have a foundation. And the center includes the museum, which, if any of you ever get to Dallas, I encourage you to visit. It's great. And also the library, which is under the control of the National Archives and Records Administration, and then the Institute, which is the part I run, which is where we focus on policy that covers issues of immigration, education, democratic capitalism, veterans and military families. We have two leadership programs for American citizens. One we do with the Bush 41, Clinton, and LBJ foundations. Another we focus on veterans that we do ourselves. And then we also do work in the global area, supporting freedom and democracy, political activists, global health, which is very important still to President and Mrs. Bush. For those of you who may be aware, President Bush launched the PEPFAR program, which is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, in 2003, that has saved now over 26 million lives, which is extraordinary. And Afghanistan has been a major focus of our work, and Ukraine has been a major focus of my work as well as the organization's. And lastly, we produce an online journal called The Catalyst. So that probably is more than you needed, Dan, but it's a little background.
Not nearly enough, David. When you mention human rights, and you mentioned George W. Bush, I would venture to say there are some issues where Republicans and Democrats do not differ at all. And I think one of them is policy towards Africa. As you pointed out, it was the Republican president who created PEPFAR. 26 million lives now in jeopardy as PEPFAR is being taken apart. The topics that come to mind, which do not seem to be ideologically distinguished, are human rights and Africa. Can you think of any others where the two parties basically have the same objectives?
Well, let me just mention on Africa. It was under President Clinton that the AGOA Act was passed, and that actually is up for renewal, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, and that was something continued into the Bush administration. Power Africa under the Obama administration. So this proves your point, Dan, about how from Democratic to Republican administrations, at least in the past, there's been a lot of support for Africa. We just last week here at the Bush Institute rolled out rather a new project focused on Africa that stresses the importance of U.S. engagement on the African continent, and also argues that if, frankly, the United States doesn't engage on the African continent, the Russians and the Chinese are going to fill the void. And in fact, in many cases, they already are. And
Yep.
so we were in Washington last week, had many meetings on the Hill and with journalists and others making this case. And it's on our website for those who are interested. If you go on bushcenter.org, you can find this new Africa initiative that we launched last week. Democracy and human rights generally has been an area where the Republicans and Democrats have been united. Generally, we've also been united when it comes to pushing back on Soviet and Russian aggression over the years. And there had been general unity in dealing with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Differences over some of the details, important details. I don't mean to minimize those. But I referenced isolationism when I was talking about the creation of Freedom House. And in both parties, there are wings that are isolationist in nature, who believe that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not the problem of the United States. That's for the Europeans to deal with. It's none of our business. And I and President Bush and the people who work here firmly reject that thinking, and believe very strongly that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is one of the most important issues we face right now. And U.S. support for Ukraine is one of the most important. There has also been a fair bit of unity, I would say, Dan, when it comes to dealing with China.
Hmm.
It comes back to the issue of human rights, where the Chinese Communist Party is one of the worst abusers of human rights. And there has been general unity between Republicans and Democrats in identifying that as a threat. Concerns about China's rise and challenges to other countries in the region, particularly vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so that too has brought Republicans and Democrats generally together. And one last thing I'll mention, there have been a few surveys done recently, some that target the MAGA world, if you will, voters who identify as MAGA supporters who favor strong U.S. leadership. And I think that is important because despite that isolationist, loud tendency you hear on both the Republican and Democratic sides, the majority of Americans recognize the importance of U.S. leadership, working together with our allies, because if the U.S. doesn't lead, bad guys are going to fill the void. And that's not a world I think that we want to live in.
Very much agreed, and I think we all agree with that. I have, oh, um, let me, the question of human rights in China, let me share with you, without judgment, an interesting conversation I had with a brilliant Chinese student who's now at George Washington University in Washington, who pointed out to me the concept of human rights. When we in the West refer to that, we think primarily of freedom of speech,
Yeah.
freedom from fear, and such. And this very intriguing and very brilliant Chinese student said, for us in China, human rights means having a job and a predictable future. Now that's fascinating to me. My first reaction was, I don't like that. But then when I thought about it, I realized that there are legitimate cultural differences. David, we spoke a few weeks ago about something called tactical empathy, which is the need to understand the other, not only in a situation of conflict, but when there's some difference of opinion or difference of objectives, to understand the. I'm just sharing that conversation. I don't feel prepared to judge that. I just found it very intriguing. For everybody's benefit, just
Hey, Dan, can I just jump in on that point? Sorry to
please
interrupt you.
do. No, please do. Please do.
That is not a new phenomenon. I remember in 2008 when I was in the State Department as the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and it wasn't just a difference with the Chinese, it was difference with the Europeans. The United States over the years has tended to emphasize political rights and civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom of assembly, freedom of association, the importance of a free press. In Europe too, they recognize those rights. They don't ignore those. But they too, like you identified from your former student, emphasize the importance of the right to healthcare, the right to a home, and those kinds of things. There's more emphasis in Europe and other places on economic and social rights than we place in the United States. And as you know, there are debates in the United States about
Yeah.
universal health care and all of that. But we have tended in our policy over the decades to emphasize the political rights and civil liberties, whereas some
Mhm.
other countries don't necessarily ignore those. Chinese government does, but emphasize more the social and
Mhm.
cultural and economic
Yeah.
rights.
No, I appreciate that. And that, of course, brings up the question of negative rights and positive rights. And this is a big debate. Um, Conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation consider negative rights to be legitimate. In other words, if I am mugged in the street or if a crime is committed against me, then the state can do something to punish the person who did that. The same conservatives will say positive rights. Sounds good, but there's no way you can enforce positive rights. One example once given to me by a conservative, if a journalist in Libya is persecuted, what do we do in the West to object to that? Do we then persecute one of our journalists? It's an interesting argument. I believe in positive rights, but we should be aware that many American conservatives do not, and that's one reason they have issues with Europe, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and the good side of that is in the United States and in some countries as well, there is something we can do if a journalist in Libya or anywhere else has his or her human rights violated, and that is something called the Global Magnitsky Act.
I
Uh,
was going to ask, with
yes.
the DRL was the founding place for that. What? Yeah, say what you were going to say, and then I'm going to
Well,
ask you
so
about.
yeah,
Yeah,
in 2012, the Congress and the U.S. Senate in particular, by a vote of 92 to 4, nothing happens with a vote margin of 92 to 4 anymore.
right.
But in 2012, the US Senate, after the House had already passed legislation focused on Russia, this was called the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law and Accountability Act. And it imposed sanctions, which means visa freeze and asset freeze on Russian officials responsible for gross human rights abuses. In 2016, that legislation was expanded to become a global policy of the United States, not just restricted to Russia. And it also added the element of corruption. So not only if an official was engaged in gross human rights abuses, but if it was engaged in significant corruption, the United States could go ahead and deny that person a visa and freeze the assets, if any were held in US financial institutions. So there are mechanisms in place that the United States can use to hold violators of human rights in other countries responsible. And there are lots of debates and discussions about the consistency in our application of Magnitsky legislation, and those are fair and legitimate debates. But there are things we can do. And it's important, I think, for folks to understand. In the past, I don't know, to be honest with you, Dan, if this still happens because of the changes at the State Department. But in the past, the State Department used to solicit input from outside organizations and individuals with recommendations on people to examine for possible sanctions under
Mhm.
the Magnitsky Act.
Um, and then, as a footnote, Bill Browder, whose obsession became the
Yes.
Magnitsky Act, his lawyer, who was murdered in a Soviet jail, or
Yep.
maybe Russian jail,
Yeah, the Russian
Sergei
jail. Yep.
Magnitsky.
Yep.
Um,
2011. Yep.
and Bill, with his very good obsession, brought this to something like 30 or 40 other countries
Yeah.
that have similar legislation. Um, I must ask the grim question: what will be the future of global Magnitsky if DRL is basically taken apart?
It doesn't look very good, to be honest. And it seems to have gotten politicized because a judge in Brazil was hit with Magnitsky sanctions because he ruled against Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil. He was convicted and sentenced for his role in trying to overthrow the his successor and not recognize the results of the Brazilian election. That is not what Magnitsky is intended to do. That was a legitimate process in Brazil. People may not have liked it, but it certainly didn't warrant the application of Magnitsky sanctions against that judge. And so it's important that the standards be upheld in using the Magnitsky Act, and not get politicized that way.
Um, yes, I need to remind people to mute themselves. Um, okay, here we are. So the question, I guess, David, is if DRL is reduced. Excuse me, everybody, while I mute once again, everybody. We're getting feedback, and I don't know who's doing this.